find ourselves in a world these days full of reprehensible politicians and bad behavior. We're probably not in such a different world than many worlds that our ancestors have lived in before. But it does seem more than ever that any kind of moral or ethical guidance has completely escaped those who lead us, and people seem to be more selfish and scared than ever. Fear is something we have spoken about on this show before. Fear is something which paralyzes us. And these days we look around at this challenging world that we're in and often experience fear. I've spoken about fear as essentially a negative thing, a negative emotion, and where it comes from and how we must face it. But what about courage? What do we do about facing this challenging world when we are overcome by those fears? So I thought I'd take a visit into some thoughts, philosophical and psychological, about fear and courage, and maybe help reset our thinking a little bit about that and redefine what courage really is and how we should develop it. Courage is something immensely valued in our culture. And as a result of that, it's pretty much something that we are told that we should want, and that we are told that we need it. It's one of those things that identifies a good person, a person of good character, or a person who's worthy of our respect in some way. And we see that throughout our stories, whether we're looking at ancient biblical tales like David and Goliath, or we're looking at fairy tales that require people to take the courageous step, modern fairy tales like The Lord of the Rings, which is a great example of characters acting under extreme situations with great culture. Our culture is full of these kind of stories, often exemplified, I think, for me, in the story of The Wizard of Oz, where in The Wizard of Oz, the witch is identified as the enemy, and specifically Dorothy's cohorts include a lion who lacks courage, and in order to face the witch must gain courage, and some of the story is devoted to the story of how the lion found his courage, how he found his heart. In fact, the word courage comes from the French word heart. So it is in fact something that is seen as absolutely critical to who we are and how we have to behave in the world. It is heroic. We raise our children on these stories. Never mind The Wizard of Oz, look at Harry Potter, for example. It's meant to inspire not only excitement about what the characters are going through, but also inspire courage in ourselves. I can be like that character. Remember the lion, or remember Harry, or remember David and Goliath even. I can be like that too. Is it correct that we should inculcate this culture of courage? Or are there some kind of limits, and what is it really based on? Robert Kennedy, the brother of the US President John F. Kennedy, said, "The world demands the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a temper of the will, a quality of the imagination, a predominance of courage over timidity, of the appetite for adventure over the life of ease." That's certainly something that is reflected in those stories that are meant to inspire us. And what Kennedy is suggesting, that whether we like it or not, the world demands it of us, that we are supposed to have an appetite for adventure because we require courage. And he defines the opposite of courage as timidity. When we look in a dictionary, courage is often defined as that quality of mind or of spirit that enables a person to face difficulty, danger, pain, etc. without fear. That's from dictionary.com. Even the old Webster Dictionary lists fearlessness as a synonym of courage. So there is unmistakably a school of thought in our culture and in our world that courage relates to the absence of fear. That when we behave fearlessly, we are behaving courageously. Well, that is something that's arguable. I mean, the first question we need to ask is, what is wrong with fear? You know, we define ourselves this way. We define courage versus timidity. But it might be worth pointing out that often in nature, so-called timidity or fear is the more desirable attribute. Nature created in us very strong innate disposition to self-preservation. And we see it in other creatures all the time. The majority of creatures, in most situations, would rather not act courageously. They'll move away from danger rather than move towards danger. And it's natural preservation. Essentially, courageously sacrificing yourself or whatever for the benefit of people who are not related to you or other members of the species that are not related to you is basically unnatural. Nature says run when you can, because there isn't a good reason to risk sacrificing yourself, unless, of course, in the case of animals, they're protecting their young. So when it benefits someone genetically related to us, in other words, a member of our own family, then unmistakably courage is appropriate. Cultural norms are very different to that, and in contrast to that natural tendency to act fearful or timid as often as possible unless you have to overcome it in order to protect your own. But cultural norms are not like that. Cultural norms reward courageous behavior. We celebrate courageous behavior, especially during war. And in war, we are so expected to behave with courage that cowardice is often punished. While courage is biologically unnatural, but culturally it is so valued, cowardice is in fact the natural response to danger, because like any other creature, we are prone to flee from situations that threaten our livelihood or threaten our well-being. War is such a situation, and even though in some sense we're supposedly protecting our own, in that situation we are mostly protecting what does not belong to us and what is not us. So it seems as if war requires a level of courage that goes against nature. To a large extent that's true. It's very rare to find war amongst any other species apart from our own. So for men and women at war, cowardice is the most stigmatized possible behavior. We esteem those who behave courageously in war, and we scorn the cowardly, to the extent that during the First World War, men were shot for behaving cowardly, for being overcome by fear and not being able to go into battle, for refusing to fight. The sentence was death. That shows how strongly cultural factors can override even the most basic of biological instincts. It is true that we look back on that with a little bit of alarm nowadays, but the feeling behind that is not unfamiliar. We might not be willing to execute someone who behaves in a cowardly fashion in most situations, but we certainly understand where the ethic for that came from and are not surprised by it. We know that having to fight in war often requires a certain amount of psychological programming that we could comfortably call brainwashing. We all know, we've all seen how soldiers in training in the boot camp stage are not only trained to have physical strength, but they are trained to act courageously in the face of fear, or they are trained to act fearlessly. Well, clearly the fact that it requires a certain amount of brainwashing means we are knowingly overcoming a biological behavior, which is the one to run away. So the question is it appropriate then to punish someone who behaves fearfully or with so-called cowardice, if that is in fact the natural behavior? Is it appropriate to mock someone or look down upon someone who behaves with cowardice, if that is the more natural behavior? What is courage really? When is courage more appropriate than, say, when it's in such an unnatural form as the fighting of a war? Of course, one of the answers to that is moral courage. Moral courage is driven by a fear. In moral courage, the fear that we have to overcome is usually, for example, loss of face in front of the peer group. And we also fear loss of integrity or authenticity. And the fear of that might encourage us to act. So if we realize that something happening is so against our own ethic that we start feeling inauthentic, we require courage in order to overcome things like the fear of loss of face in the front of others. A person who confronts their peers, say about a racist remark that was made, is acting with moral courage, because in that situation they have to overcome fear of rejection by the group, fear of not belonging to the group, loss of face in the sight of the group. But the end result is maintaining moral integrity. So moral courage is maintaining moral integrity in the face of peer rejection. So most psychologists and philosophers, whoever gets to talk about it, agree that courage is about that kind of persistence in the face of danger. And while some might say there's a fearlessness and you require fearlessness and you need to be born with fearlessness in your character, others suggest that the presence of fear or the absence of fear is not about courage. And most suggest that the absence of fear is not courage at all. That's an interesting thought. If a person is fearless, then the component of overcoming fear and overcoming your biology is actually not an issue. There's no reason to avoid something or run away from something if you're not afraid of it. So if you're fearless, acting in its face doesn't really seem to be courageous. If a person is courageous and if a person acts in a situation where others might be afraid, but they're actually not afraid, what we're really doing by saying that they're courageous is we are making some kind of virtue of a situation that is really just a natural response to them. It's not exactly the same to others, but to them, if their behavior, if their instinct is to run forward when everyone else is to run backwards, well, that's not exactly courage. Unless we actually experience fear, physically or subjectively or psychologically, courage is actually not required. So courage is not about not having fear. And courage is not about overcoming fear. Courage is about being driven by our fears. Courage is about action when fear causes us to act. So it is a quality of mind that allows us to act in the face of difficulty or danger or something like that, despite our fears. If we don't experience fear and anxiety about doing something, well then basically it's not so hard to do it, and it doesn't require great strength to do or great courage to do. So courage is actually potentially a component of fear. Courage arises out of fear and seems to allow us to apply our fear in a more constructive and meaningful fashion. Overcoming that which causes the fear produces the courage. It is possible that facing the fear of shame or of humiliation or of being punished for something could spur us to courage, and that is courage born of fear. There's the other kind of dubious courage is that sometimes what looks like courage is motivated by the fear that others find you out, that you're not courageous, or that in some way you're weak or timid. So when it's fear of not being seen as strong and courageous and all of those kind of things, well, that is not courage either. When you face fear of being harmed or of your family being harmed, and you have to rise above that and act courageously, when fear is the driving force, but courage is about what you fear, well, that's courage. But if the fear is about not being seen as courageous and about being seen as weak, well, that's really cowardice that we're talking about, not courage. Cowardice, in that context, is the fear of what others think about you, of not behaving the way others expect you to behave. So clearly, courage is not a virtue in and of itself. We need to be careful of lauding and praising courage and encouraging courage in our young people without being a little bit more morally clear or ethically clear. Because, as you've heard, courage is itself potentially a little morally ambiguous. The real question is, what is that courage in service of? That really lets us see whether it's courageous or not. So courage is not really the absence of fear. It's the judgment that something else is more important than fear, and that despite our fear, we will act on it. When we decide to act courageously, it's because we already see that the risk is worth it. There is a risk, and it's worth doing because I'm going to achieve the thing that the fear is blocking me from. Again, morally ambiguous. If achieving is I'm looked as courageous in the eyes of other people, as I said, morally that's cowardice. It was Nelson Mandela who said, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. Our own Madiba, the font of wisdom. When we look at the great philosophers, we see that Aristotle says, essentially, that in order to develop courage, we must practice doing courageous acts. And he suggests that courage can be a moral habit, which is really, if we see it as a moral or as an ethic, then when we look at, for example, what do we do in the face of racism by others, or what do we do in the face of something that we see as morally or ethically unacceptable for us? In Aristotle's view, by learning to act in the face of that all the time is how we develop true courage. That does sound like it makes sense in the world that we know. Because in the world that we know, we have to face that all the time. As we know, as we see very clearly in this country, it's an ongoing issue to have to deal with, be it racism or bad behavior in the face of others. And what Aristotle is suggesting is that if your previous performance succeeds, do it again. It will be easier to do it again. It's true that someone is more likely to face a situation courageously if they have done it before and they now believe they can meet the challenge. And that's why it is necessary for us to develop that moral courage that says never let something slip when it's unmistakably immoral, like racism, and even in the face of the fear of the rejection by peers. But fearlessness is not the same thing. So what we're seeing is that whatever the circumstances are, we must turn the fear into something that drives us. Not exactly overcome the fear, but rather to be driven by it. So, I mean, even that Wizard of Oz in the story of courage that the lion finds says that true courage is facing danger when you are afraid. It's not fearlessness. So the first principle of courage is feeling fear and yet choosing to act. Another form of courage that is driven by fear, persevering in the face of adversity, and, as we've already seen, standing up for what is right. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu famously said, "From caring comes courage." We live in a country where we have a history of enormously courageous people, Nelson Mandela and many, many others, who, because of the moral importance of what they were fighting for, and because of their care, they were able to develop courage, the care for those who suffered so enormously under the yoke of apartheid and of colonialism. That brought out courage, and there was a lot to fear for those people. It wasn't fearlessness that drove the courage of the struggle in this country. There was a lot to be afraid of because they faced a ruthless enemy. Letting go of what's familiar is another way that we have to be courageous and face courage. And as we know, it's that old story of, if you keep one foot in the door, you can't really go into the next room. You can't hold yourself back when you're faced by the unknown. Sometimes we have to go into the unknown. So letting go of the familiar is another principle of using fear to drive courage. And finally, and perhaps one of the most challenging of all, is facing suffering with dignity. That can also take an enormous amount of courage because suffering usually involves a lot of fear. And we often want to praise someone who is in a situation, a life-threatening situation, for being fearless. And we need to remember that courage is with fear, not without fear. Courage is being driven by your fear to do something that benefits yourself or benefits those that you love, or that is morally correct and sets that example, and that which allows you to rise above the fear, but it doesn't mean there is no fear. So what do we learn from that? Fear and courage go hand in hand. Courage, as we've heard, is not about being fearless. So if you feel fearful, if you feel timid, if you believe that other people judge you that way, if you see yourself how you get into bad situations because of your timidity, don't judge yourself and don't allow others to judge you. remember that there's a process to turn that courage into action. In the end, when we understand that courage is a higher manifestation of our fears, we realize even when we are the most fearful person, all of us have the potential for true moral courage. A few thoughts for the day in a difficult and challenging world. Join me again next week when we'll be checking out some more news from the world of the Stoics.